A few days later, trying not to be impatient, I called the shipping company in Dartford to ask whether the clearance had come from customs. It hadn't, but they gave me the number of the customs office in Barking and also told me at the same time that the stuff itself was being stored in a third small town on the far east of London called West Thurrock, just the other side of the river from Dartford. I was sensing this was going to be a long haul. I bought a phone card, but it was a new kind of phone card. And the call box only took the old kind of phone card. So I went back to the shop to buy a packet of cigarettes to get £1 or 2 in change. And I called the customs office in Barking. They said that their address was actually Ripple Road, not River Road, as I'd heard it. And given that I didn't know their postcode either, I thought the scant chance of my C3 form ever reaching them. So I asked if I could come in and pick up a C3 form in person. Yeah, but you should know that although Ripple Road is our mailing address, we're actually on Box Lane. Is that in Barking? Oh yeah, Box Lane, Barking. How would I get there? I'll be using public transport. Where are you? Chiswick. God. Well, get to Barking, take the 369 bus to the end of the line and ask from there. Well, it happened there was a partial tube strike, so the district line was completely down. So I decided to take the Piccadilly line that was stopping at Turnham Green specially because of the strike, change to the Victoria, take that up to Black Horse Road and catch an overground train back down to Barking, which is a sizable and bustling town. The driver of the 369 had no idea where Box Lane was. He asked a rather mournful-looking woman on the front seat whether she knew, but she just mewed vaguely. Nevertheless, we set off, poking around the one-way system, past the fancied-up pubs for young people and the strip malls and the incongruously august Abbey. About halfway, there was a change of driver. The original driver, as he was getting off, tried to kiss the mournful woman on the front seat. See you later, he said, his nose hovering like a bee near her cheek. She swatted him away amiably. Giving you a hard time, is he? Asked the replacement. We pressed on. We came into a nondescript estate of identical post-war housing. The streets were deserted. There was a row of 4 shops and a tiny circle in the road. We went beyond that until the last of the passengers disembarked as the road came to an end in front of a fence. I asked the driver if he knew where Box Lane was. He says, yeah, let's go around the fence, up the hill, turn right. That led to a promising kind of industrial estate with containers and boats. And I found myself staring at a frosted glass sliding window with an electronic buzzer by the side of it. I pressed the buzzer, the window opened, and there was a young woman there who gave me a C3 form, and when I started filling it in wrong, gently corrected me. She said, I can't promise that we can clear this today. Well, I'd only come to make sure I actually got a C3 form and maybe to hand it back in. So this actually led to an upswing in hope. She told me to wait for 10 minutes while she showed the form to the mystery men with a rubber stamp that I could see over her shoulder. The news was good. And that made the day a lot more involved, but also a lot more promising. I went straight back to the middle of Barking. There were 2 buses waiting, but the drivers were on break and wouldn't answer questions. So I went to the railway station, but the guy selling tickets had never heard of West Thurrock. But when I tried to describe to him where it was, he guessed maybe Tilbury Town was the closest station. So I bought a ticket, and then I thought I could call the shipping office in Dartford. They'll probably know better. So I rang them, and they weren't sure. After some thought, they guessed that actually the closest station was Grays, which is on the same line as Tilbury Town, but 1 stop closer. So outside Grays Station was a short shopping precinct. It was beginning to rain. A homemade flyer stuck to a lamppost advertised the heaviest band in Thurrock. I saw there was a taxi firm across the road, so I went there to get an estimate. The guy who worked there was wearing a black bandana, and he looked at the map on the wall behind him for about a minute and a half and didn't seem to be able to find West London. Finally, he said, £35. Any number of buses go from Grays to Tilbury Town, to West Thurrock rather, Grays to West Thurrock. My only problem now was finding Oliver Road. I asked the driver and he suggested I got off at the stop just before this roundabout, saying he thought it was near there. So I got off, and of all things next to this bus stop, there was a low, wide, single-story log cabin. It was a transport cafe called the Log Cabin. I went in, and there was a guy playing a one-arm bandit by the door, so I asked him if he knew where Oliver Road was. He said, yeah, just go down the roundabout, bear left, follow the road round, you'll find a Ford tractor place on your right, and it's a longer walk than it sounded, through another industrial estate. I never did see the tractors, and only by chance, through a wire fence, did I catch the name of the company I was looking for on the side of this cabin. Somehow I got round the fence, I don't remember how. Went up to the cabin, up some steps, knocked on the door, there was no answer, so I went in. And there were two people sat there. There was a middle-aged man sat at a desk. He had a long nose. To me, he looked like Richard Nixon. At the other end of the office was a woman with her baby on her knee. She smiled. It was the right place. They had my stuff. There was a trunk, 2 bags, a box, and a guitar case. So determined had I been not to leave anything in anybody's basement in Toronto. This was now the sum total of my belongings. The last time I'd seen them, I'd handed them over to some anonymous hut in North Toronto without knowing or even bothering to inquire how I would ever see them again. But somehow, now they were here in front of me, they seemed more lost and abandoned than ever. I said to the people in the office, I'm looking for a phone to call a taxi. They said I could use theirs, and I felt disproportionately indebted to them. I mean, I considered offering to pay for the call, but it would have only cost a penny, or maybe 2p. But when I saw how, even as I dialed, they went back to their business, apparently obliterating me from their consciousness, I realized that really the only thing I had to offer them was my absence. So I called the cab firm in Grays, and I must have spoken to the same guy with the black bandana as before, because he gave the same enormous pause before offering the same estimate of £35 that I was sure was too little. And I wasn't confident either when he said that he'd be there at 3 o'clock, because I wasn't able to give any kind of directions to where I was. Anyway, I hauled my belongings as quietly as I could over to the door, held it open with my foot, and lifted the pieces out one by one, piling them up on the other side of the threshold. I murmured thanks without waiting for a reply and stepped outside, allowing the door to close silently against my back. Then I carried all the things down the steps and stacked them neatly out of the way and sat on the steps in the sunshine, watching an old guy fooling around with a forklift truck. He kept driving it in little semicircles and getting out to stare at the wheels. And I realized, I'd been so focused on getting things sorted out before I left Toronto that actually I hadn't really had any time to imagine what I was going to do here in England. I suddenly felt as if I couldn't quite remember why I'd come to England at all or what I was expecting to do. When the cab arrived, the first thing the driver said was, "Oh, it's £45. Is that all right?" I said, "Yeah. Is the luggage okay?" When I heard the clunk of him unlocking the back of the car, I carried the stuff over and I had it all loaded in before he could ease himself out of the car and was standing before me, protesting mildly. "Oh, I would have done that." He was in his 50s. tall, skinny, slightly stooped, missing the teeth from one side of his head, wearing jeans and a denim jacket with the arms sawn off. He said, I don't really know where Chiswick is. Sorry, mate. I have no idea where we are, so. Earnest as a Mountie in a silent movie, he said, we'll find it. Now, I might have felt more comfortable, actually, if he'd said this as a kind of statement of fact rather than the expression of a deep-seated belief, a dream that wouldn't die. But nevertheless, we got in the car and we set off. And it turned out that the route to West London was far, far more obvious than we'd ever dared imagine. There were enormous signs by the side of the road saying, West London. All we had to do was decide whether to go through the town centre or take the ring road. As we pulled onto the motorway, he said, good name you've got there. What? Williams. My name too. Always liked it. Good name, innit? Yeah, yes, yeah, it is, yeah. Yeah, we exchanged first names and shook hands to congratulate each other on our good fortune. It was a long drive with very little to comment on going past. I spent the first while studying the tattoos on his left arm. There was an ornamental scroll with 4 names on it, and then Elvis in block capitals, and then a smaller scroll with just 1 name on it. I guessed, and he admitted, that his 5th child had been born years later than the others. They'd been a surprise. He said, he nodded to my guitar in the back. He says, do you play the, what is it, violin? No, guitar. No, not really. I don't really. How about you? He said, no, just to mess about, really. 1 song, that's all. March of the Mods. Know it? Only play it on 1 string. Can't remember the notes now. Hey, is that one? Probably, yeah. No, I've never been to Chiswick before. That's not a bad place. Really? I never knew that. Well, I quite like it. You've got my curiosity going now. And thereafter, at long and maybe regular intervals, say maybe every 7.5 minutes, he would broach the subject again of how much he was looking forward to going to Chiswick. I mean, in between, we were just silent, as though we were hammering at the door of our thoughts and receiving no reply. But each time he mentioned it, it was like he ratcheted up the enthusiasm, so that by the time we were, at last, leaving the ring road, he was positively marveling. Goes to show, when I woke this morning, literally no idea. And even when we were amongst Chiswick, he did a good job of marveling at it. It's just like where we've come from. And indeed it was. The details of ordinary urban landscapes somehow stimulated us, and conversation swelled to a trickle. He asked me why I'd come back from Canada, and I explained as best I could. He said, yeah, life's too short not to see people. He asked what I did for a living, and when I told him, he says, he says, well, I hope it works out. I really do. I'll keep an eye out for you. I said, well, yeah, I hope it works. Everything works. I'll keep an eye out. Well, anyway, I tipped him as generously as I dared, shook hands with him again. It felt like an historic occasion, of course. So I was glad that Cecil was my driver that day. I think what I like most about him is his complete lack of irony. It took me 20, 25 minutes to haul everything up the stairs, shove it under the bed or wherever in a cupboard, and then it was done. Then I really lived in London. The playwright had agreed to meet me, so I took a train up to Manchester. In those days, most trains, the last carriage was reserved for smokers, but this one had no smoking stickers in the windows. Some lit up anyway. Half-hearted objections were met with shrugs. The non-smokers moved to other carriages, and after we left the station, this guard came through and started peeling the stickers off with his thumb. He beamed at me. "You'd get arrested if you did this." A friend of mine from London once said about Manchester, "The whole town is how I've always imagined the wrestling world to be." Now, he was canny enough, I thought, to understand that this would be received as a compliment, because the peculiarity of the people of Manchester is that they're pleased to describe themselves as blunt, corruptible, and able to make educated judgments about violence. Mancunians, as their official name is, express their indirectness by droning on about how direct they are. The complexity of their manners are couched in this endless improvisation on the theme of their artlessness. Fucking no side to me, mate. Don't worry with all that subtlety and that psychology. I just tell it how it is. Do you know what I mean? Just like fucking straight up. That's all I know. Do you know? That's all I can do. Like that. It's all on and on and on like that. You know, the one sure sign of fondness is an insult. And they lavish insults upon themselves and their city. I say they, and I mean we, of course, because I'm from there. There've been times when I was prepared to think of myself as not coming from England, but I've always known I'm from Manchester. It's like a stain on the soul. The streets, the air are as familiar to me as the inside of my own mouth, except that on this occasion, it was only a few days after the IRA had set off an explosion, the largest explosion on the mainland since the Second World War. And I'd arrived early to study the results. All around the city centre, there was broken glass underfoot, particularly on the smaller streets. A quiet crowd lingered by a barrier in St. Anne's Square. I thought there was a strange hush lingering over the city. But it took just moments to recognize broken glass and sense a silence. And then I was just sort of there early. So I did what I always did when I got to Manchester. I went to the coffee bar downstairs at the Central Library. Say what you like about Manchester. It is the town where girls were invented. And I'd first studied them in that coffee bar at the Central Library, only roaming the stacks upstairs, really allowing chance to dictate the books that I picked up, to find stuff to read, to try and impress the girls with down in the coffee bar. So anyway, I bought myself a coffee and I sat there. And this older guy came in with several copies of the Manchester Evening News rammed up under his armpit, and with a certain lunatic courtesy, he leaned into the counter and he said to the young guy there, "Could I have a cup of coffee and 2 slices of bread and butter, please, if that's not too much trouble?" And the man behind the counter said, "Please, at least buy a bit of cheese. I've got a business to run here." Well, the customer reared back. His gaze swept the room imperiously, as if he was checking out who was listening to him. I was, but I pretended not to be. And he leaned back into the guy behind the counter and he said, "Do you remember the old Manchester Hippodrome?" "Yes," said the guy behind the counter, though it was clearly a lie because he was 26 in Italian. "Do you remember, happy days are here again?" "Well, they're not, they're gone." "You remember Gone with the Wind?" "Well, it's blowing." I thought, I've had enough of this, and I left. What should I do now? I know, I'll go and check out Hume, see how it is. It's an area about 25 minutes walk from where I was standing on the front steps of the Central Library. In the years I've been away, I'd had an amazing knack in my brief visits to Manchester of bumping into one particular friend of mine. And at one of these chance encounters, he told me he'd moved to Hume. I knew the area from my youth, when it was freshly built. And it was mostly consisted of enormous low-rise apartment blocks that were built in near complete circles that were called crescents, but looked like fortresses and were linked by aerial walkways. A friend reminded me at that first meeting that the final insult was that these crescents were named after great architects like Sir Christopher Wren and Sir Charles Barry. And he explained to me that the place had been built originally as cheap housing for young families, but that when the first small child fell off a walkway, the original tenants were all moved out. And the city began using it as a dumping ground for people they couldn't think of anywhere else to put, like students, criminals, and the mentally ill. In fact, rumour had it that there had been a conscious policy to put all of these troublemakers into just one area as a way of policing them easier. If so, the plan backfired because the physical geography made it very difficult to police. So it became a kind of lawless enclave, more a refuge than a pen. But still, somehow, had something to fascinate my peaceable, law-abiding friend who dealt generously from this great store of anecdotes, mostly describing a kind of cartoon criminality, all the while insisting that the place offered a precious opportunity to study how people operated when they had less government. And in fact, when the city announced plans to knock the place down, many of the locals, who by now were calling themselves humanoids, interpreted this as the action of an anxious establishment trying to disperse its enemies. And my friend had joined this housing co-op that was dedicated to trying to rebuild Hume while keeping the good aspects of it and learning from the mistakes. When I ran into him next about a year later, he gave me the walking tour of the area. I remember that day, the place was covered in graffiti saying, Charlie Davis ruined Hume. And in the office of the housing co-op, sat next to an enormous model of Hume as it was going to be, Charlie Davis sat drinking tea from a chipped mug. He said, people don't believe this place. I've seen the local kids strip a strange car of anything movable in 10 minutes. I wondered if the locals gave him any trouble. He said, well, they call it taxing. They come up to you with a knife or something and they say, sorry, mate, I've got to tax you. You just keep £10 in your pocket, everything else in your sock. And how about the graffiti? He said, yeah. It was a bit strange walking around the next day. I think it was the Trotskyists. The next time I met my mate, about another year later, he told me that the night the Crescents finally closed down, the locals had a big party, lit bonfires, and that a performance art troupe called the Dogs of War tipped cars off the roofs. He offered me a few days' work in the area, actually, and I had the privilege of seeing the Crescents being knocked down sort of day by day. I mean, there was one evening where one of them had its whole front wall ripped off, and you could see rows and rows of drug dealers' living rooms, many of them decorated with appalling murals. 2 nights after that, it was just an enormous crescent of rubble, with one massive pillar sticking up at the end, with "Women Beware" painted hugely on the side in black paint. And that was 2 years ago. And I went back to Hume to see how it was now. To my amazement, I got to the entrance. Written over the top was "Welcome to Hell" still. And the other bits of graffiti I recognized from the last time were, "There's no government like no government, and we're not criminals, we're just fucking poor." Once I passed through there, I was amazed to see that Otterburn Close still stood. And all the windows were boarded up. But there were cars parked there, and I could see some of the lights were still lit in the stairwell. Amazingly, maybe there were people living there. 2 guys were fooling around with a camera. Now and then a gust of wind would blow up, making the boards on the windows rattle. In fact, one of the boards had come off and you could see into a living room. It was deserted, but it had this big painting of a tall man with goat's horns on it. Suddenly I heard this cheeping sound. And I realized it was coming from my pocket. It was my mobile phone. I'd never heard it ring before. Mike was the only person with my number. So, and he was calling to tell me the playwright was running a couple of hours late. He said, "You know him, you know." I didn't think so. I mean, this playwright's world famous, really. So I was pretty sure that I would know if I'd ever run into him. He says, "Well, he knows you." And he went on to say that when the playwright had joined the Manchester Youth Theatre at the age of 15, I'd been assigned the task of meeting him and his mate at the station and taking them to their accommodation for the summer. Only something went wrong, so you all ended up walking around Didsbury looking for, I remember the evening. I was 19. It was the first time I'd been given any responsibility. So when things went wrong, I followed the models of my youth and became enraged. I remember striding through the streets with them sort of tagging along behind me, with their shoulder back. What I couldn't remember and rack my brains about was whether I'd been rude about them. If I had, I marvelled that his revenge had lain in wait for 23 years. But it was kind of nice in a way to think I'd actually finally managed to see my own footfall, I walked back towards the city centre, this time taking a different route, going across a footbridge that became world famous when a rock band posed for photographs on it. I spent exactly one evening in the legendary Manchester scene of the 80s and 90s. It was New Year's Eve, 1979 to 80. It was a party at the Factory Club. I remember there was a band was doing an impromptu set. The vocalist was sitting on the stage going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, over and over. And this sort of smallish, quite slight fellow with a strong local accent and combat jacket comes up to me and goes, "Hello, mates, how are you?" Oh, listen, we had a bit of a chat and on he went. And about 2 paces behind him was his manager, rolling his eyes going, "Oh, it's only a fucking rock star hanging around at parties going, 'Hi, I'm just an ordinary bloke.'" And this other lad came up, started chatting to me. He was wearing a green nylon wind cheat and he said, "I'm in a band too, the Out of Tunes." "Oh yeah," I said, "what sort of stuff do you do?" "Anything, absolutely anything. You request it, we'll play it. Mind, it'll be out of tune, but that's like our trademark." I've wondered since, whatever happened to the Out of Tunes? I mean, in the years, decades after that, it took gumption not to become famous if you were from Manchester. And I decided to take a bus, kill a bit of time, go back round some old haunts, Withington, Didsbury Southern Cemetery. There was a lad, sort of, just before puberty, sort of lad about 12 or 13. He had a straw and a little piece of paper that he chewed, and he went, turned his straw into a blowpipe, and he smacked on the back of this girl, sat 2 seats in front of him. And the big bloke sat next to the girl went, "Oi, stop that." He just went, "Fuck off." And this murmur of disapproval went through the bus, and the big bloke stood up. I mean, really stood, loomed. He was massive. He goes up to the kid. He goes, "Hey, listen, kid. When I was your age, I wanted to be a rude boy, but you don't know me," said the kid. "No, listen, I'm explaining. I used to want to be a rude boy like you." "No, you don't know me." "No, listen, I am explaining. You don't know me." When I finally met the playwright, there was a surprise in store. Because the Rendezvous was this well-lit, elegant, quite swank coffee house on a whole row of similar places where, back in my day, there'd just been this silent row of warehouses alongside the canal. And I didn't recognize the diffident lad of 15 and the cordial, confident professional who steered us skillfully through the mild embarrassment of the conversation, he didn't mention that fateful night of long ago, or indeed the youth theatre at all. In fact, we just talked really about the street, which he explained was part of what was now known as the gay village, that stretched between the two gay pubs of the old days, the Union and the Rembrandt. And I like the fact that it was now the brightest part of Manchester, because it used to be the darkest section of the city centre. I can't remember how, but we ended up chatting about how come, despite great success, he was still living in the north. He just shrugged and said, more real. Now, he didn't say this as if it was like, expression of a deep-seated belief or a bone of contention or anything. Really, he was just saying the sort of thing that one northerner can say to another. Yeah, it's more real. I smiled. I said, well, it is for actors. I said, we've got to move down there in order to get work up here. We smiled, shook hands, and I set off. As I was walking back to the station, just by Newton Street, I saw there was this skinny little fellow with a beard who was like sitting in the puddle of his own sleeping bag out just on the pavement there, And as he was sitting there, this big strapping young lad dressed in tracksuit bottoms and t-shirt swung without warning this savage karate kick right at this guy's face and stopped just about an inch short of his cheek. Once he had his attention, he leaned in and he said, why can't you make something of yourself like I have instead of just sitting around being a useless bastard? Thereby enunciating to my mind the dream of Manchester, which is aspiration without refinement. I caught the train back, and a few miles south of Stoke, we paused for an hour in the middle of some field. By and by, the train company dispatched some ombudsman to go through every carriage, apologising profusely. And one of the customers said, well, I must say, I do think it is outrageous. And the ombudsman exploded. He said, you try working for them. It's every sodding day for me. I was so pleased to get back to the civilised, peaceful South.